The briefing at the Black Sea Coastal Air Base took 40 minutes. That was 35 minutes longer than the tactical complexity of the mission required, and 5 minutes shorter than the wing commander felt the political moment deserved. The Su-24 Fencer crew, a pilot, and a weapons system officer, who had been flying together long enough to communicate professional disagreement through minor adjustments in posture alone, received their tasking with the focused attention of people who understood they were being asked to make a statement. The target was USS Donald Cook, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer currently operating in the western Black Sea on what the United States described as a routine presence patrol, and what the briefing officer described, with considerable personal investment, as a deliberate provocation requiring a firm and visible Russian answer. The mission parameters were straightforward: locate the American warship, conduct simulated attack passes, multiple passes, close passes, the kind that make a point without requiring a definition of the word incident, and return to base. The crew would carry the Khibiny electronic warfare pod on the Su-24's centerline station. The Khibiny pod, the briefing officer explained, leaning forward slightly for emphasis, was the instrument by which the American Aegis combat system would be rendered inoperable for the duration of the operation. He used the word disabled. He underlined it on the briefing slide. He said it twice. The pilot studied his flight parameters. His weapons system officer made a note. They were professionals. They had opinions. They said nothing. Outside on the ramp, the Su-24's ground crew was finishing pre-flight. The aircraft itself was, in the specific vocabulary of aviation history, a veteran. The Sukhoi Su-24 Fencer entered Soviet Air Force service in 1974. A variable sweep wing, low-level penetration aircraft, built for a geopolitical landscape that had since been reorganized twice, serving ever since in the same basic configuration with the same basic mission profile, updated in increments and maintained with the institutional tenacity of an Air Force that does not retire things until they become strictly impossible to keep flying. The Su-24 is not a bad aircraft. Its variable geometry wing is a genuine engineering achievement. Its navigation system, in the modernized M2 variant, is capable enough to do the job it was given. But it is an aircraft that was new when platform shoes were considered fashionable, and deploying its DO, with its centerline Khibiny pod and its briefed mission to disable the most advanced shipborne radar system in the world, is a specific kind of optimism that deserves to be examined before it is celebrated. The ground crew completed their checks. The engines started. The aircraft taxied. The wing commander watched it go from the operations building window and felt satisfied with the morning's work. At 12:09 local time aboard USS Donald Cook, the watch had been running for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The specific point in a 4-hour rotation, where the initial alertness has fully dissolved into the competent, settled rhythm of routine. The Black Sea was gray and unremarkable. 2-meter swells, 15-knot wind from the northwest, the kind of operational weather that career surface warfare officers describe as fine. The coffee in the Combat Information Center had been brewed at 10:30 and had achieved by 12:09 the temperature and viscosity that experienced watchstanders classify as the commitment phase. Not good, not warm, but present and therefore still being consumed, because the alternative is nothing. A second-class petty officer in the engineering spaces was annotating a maintenance log with the handwriting of someone who knows the annotation will be reviewed and has calibrated their effort at the lower boundary of legible. On the port sponson, a boatswain's mate was chipping rust from a deck fitting with a needle gun, working from left to right with the methodical persistence of a person who has made peace with the fact that the same fitting will require the same treatment in approximately 6 weeks. Because that is the compact you make with saltwater when you spend your career in it. At 12:14, the Communications Division began a scheduled diagnostic cycle on the ship's primary satellite uplink array. This was a 40-minute maintenance evolution, logged in the watch brief, required for system certification. During the window, USS Donald Cook's primary encrypted satellite communications link, the one that puts the commanding officer directly on voice with 6th Fleet and with the Romanian Air Force Operations Center at Mihail Kogalnicianu in about 11 seconds. Would be offline. The backup system could cover the function. The backup system had 30% less bandwidth and a 15-second latency penalty on encrypted voice that, in a fast-moving tactical situation, is the difference between manageable and actively inconvenient. The watch officer had noted this in the tactical picture alongside one other relevant figure, the nearest NATO-capable fighter, a Romanian F-16 on ground alert. Atsukshatis Kurin Kogorals Chianu Amaimnuraig was 9 minutes of flight time to the southwest. 9 minutes from request to scramble, not from request to on-station. On-station was 24 minutes. At 12:17, the SPY-1D phased array radar, which does not search so much as simply illuminate the entire three-dimensional airspace surrounding the ship and update its picture 400 times per second, acquired a single fixed-wing contact. Bearing 032. Range, 112 nautical miles. Altitude, 4,000 feet. Speed, 465 knots. Course, 230. The contact's heading intersected USS Donald Cook's current position. The electronic warfare operator had the contact's emission signature before the radar operator finished his bearing callout. The SLQ-32 had recognized the Su-24's navigation radar on the second pulse it received, a frequency that U.S. electronic warfare libraries had been cataloging since 1978, and could classify in the time it takes to read this sentence. Su-24 variant, high confidence, single aircraft, no additional contacts detected, no targeting radar, no weapons active indication, Khibiny pod emitting, collecting now. The classification took 8 seconds. The tactical action officer looked at the contact, looked at the communications status board showing the primary uplink offline, looked at the backup latency figure, and then did the arithmetic that the situation required. 112 miles at 465 knots is 14 minutes to visual range. Primary comms offline for 26 more minutes. Nearest fighter support 24 minutes from on-station if scrambled immediately. This was not a crisis. This was a window. A real, documented 11-minute window in which a Su-24 with undetermined ordnance status, no weapons active indication, but no confirmed clean load confirmation from any source other than the contact's own emission profile, would be operating at attack profile range while the primary communications link was offline. He notified the commanding officer at 12:18. He requested Romanian Air Force alert status at 12:19 via the backup system with the 15-second latency. The response came back at 12:20. F-16s on ground alert. Scramble available on request. He noted it. He did not yet request the scramble. There was no legal and procedural basis to scramble NATO air support against an aircraft that had not established hostile intent by any available indicator. He logged the window in the tactical picture with the word monitoring and the time. He picked up the coffee. It was barely warm. He drank it anyway. The contact was at 98 miles and closing. Here's the thing about that window that the briefing officer at the Russian airbase did not put on his slide. The rules of engagement that govern a U.S. Navy vessel's response to an aircraft conducting simulated attack passes without declared hostile intent in international airspace, while carrying no confirmed ordnance. These rules exist for reasons that are sound and legally necessary. They also mean the appropriate response to an aircraft flying attack profiles that your ship was: track it, document it, maintain the tactical picture, and wait for it to do something that met the threshold for a different response category. This is not inaction. It is precisely calibrated professional patience. The gap between provocative and legally hostile was the entire operational space the Russian crew was working in. The 11-minute window was real. The outcome was never in doubt. But the 11 minutes were 11 minutes of focused watch standing, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not read the tactical log. The primary satellite link came back online at 12:41. The Su-24 reached visual range at 12:31. The first pass crossed USS Donald Cook's bow at approximately 700 meters lateral separation and 800 feet altitude. the aircraft pulling hard left after the cross in the breakaway profile used after simulated ordnance release. The attack radar illuminated for 2.1 seconds on the inbound leg. Not a weapons lock, but the specific scan pattern associated with targeting solution development in the Su-24's attack computer. The SLQ-32 logged the illumination with the same complete fidelity it would apply to an actual targeting event. Frequency, pulse duration, scan angle, power output. The Khibiny pod was emitting across its programmed jamming spectrum. 7 discrete frequency bands, 2 modulation modes. The full operational profile that the pod's designers had specified for suppression of NATO naval radar systems. The pod was performing exactly as designed. The SPY-1D was tracking the aircraft on frequencies outside the Khibiny pod's active suppression envelope with uninterrupted clarity, computing a new engagement solution every time the aircraft changed heading, maintaining a tactical picture so complete that the tactical action officer could have told you the aircraft's fuel state within about 4%. The Khibiny pod was doing to the SPY-1D approximately what a car's high beams do to the sun, technically producing light in the relevant direction, completely irrelevant to the source it was aimed at. The officer of the deck tracked the first pass through binoculars from the bridge wing. He noted the tail number. He noted the altitude. He noted the flap configuration, approach flaps, consistent with a low-speed attack run, the kind of detail that goes in the log, because analysts value it later, even when it has no immediate tactical meaning. He put the binoculars down. "Log it," he said to no one in particular, because the log was already being written. He went back inside. His coffee was cold. The aircraft was less interesting than the coffee situation, which had been deteriorating since 10:30 and showed no signs of improving. The second pass came at 12:34, third at 12:37. By the fourth pass, the intelligence picture had already exceeded everything the European Theater Electronic Warfare Cell had collected on the Khibiny pod in the previous 18 months. This is the section that deserves the full accounting, because it is the most important thing that happened in the Black Sea that Tuesday, and no one on the Russian side of the event had any idea it was occurring. The SLQ-32 VI-3 is a passive collection system. It emits nothing. It interferes with nothing. It announces its presence to nothing. It simply receives every electronic signal in its environment with the comprehensive, unhurried attention of a recording device that has no other agenda. During the first 4 passes alone, it had compiled the Khibiny pod's complete active jamming frequency table across all 7 operational bands. Information that U.S. threat libraries had last formally updated from a captured technical document and a single brief North Atlantic encounter 3 years prior. Today's proximity was providing clean, direct collection characterization at a signal-to-noise ratio that made the previous library entries look like rough drafts. By the 6th pass, the EW operator had identified something more valuable than the frequency table: 2 mode transitions that did not match any documented Khibiny operating mode in the existing library. Not variants of known modes. New modes. Software updates, almost certainly. The specific timing signature of the transitions indicated a firmware version that had not appeared in any previous collection. This was the intelligence equivalent of finding 2 new chapters in a book you had already read completely. "Sir," the EW operator said, not looking up from his console, to the executive officer who had come down to CIC during the second pass and had been standing behind the EW station ever since. "I need to tell you something about this Khibiny pod." He paused for exactly the amount of time required to build appropriate anticipation. "It's giving me everything. Every frequency, every mode. And there are 2 modes here that are not in the library." He turned around. His expression was the specific expression of someone who has received an unexpected and significant professional gift and is taking a moment to appreciate it before getting back to work. "This is the best evolution I have had since I reported aboard this ship." He turned back to his console. He did not stop collecting. Link 16 transmitted the emission package to the European Theater Intelligence Cell at 13:02, while the Su-24 was still conducting passes overhead. The cell's acknowledgement included, unusually, a substantive response in the remarks field, rather than the standard receipt confirmation. The remarks field said, "Confirm 2 undocumented mode transitions. Maintain collection. Priority tasking. Characterize transition trigger conditions." The EW operator read this and smiled in the specific way of someone whose morning has just become considerably more purposeful. He maintained collection. He documented the trigger conditions across 4 subsequent passes. The Su-24 crew, in the cockpit above, had no instrument that told them any of this was happening. 2 Romanian F-16s had been scrambled at 12:29 at USS Donald Cook's request, not as an engagement force, because there was nothing yet to engage, but as a visible statement of alliance presence and as a precaution against the situation developing in a direction that the rules of engagement would respond to differently. They arrived at 12:53 and established a patrol orbit 8 miles to the southwest. Their arrival was noticed immediately in the Su-24 cockpit. The passes continued regardless. The weapons system officer monitored his jamming effectiveness display. The display was telling him what the pod's designers had intended it to tell him. Jamming frequencies active, power, output nominal, suppression indicators positive. He was watching the correct instrument for the wrong question. The display was designed to confirm that the Khibiny pod was emitting as specified. It was emitting as specified. What the display was not designed to measure, what no instrument in the Su-24's cockpit was equipped to measure, was whether the specific frequencies being jammed were the frequencies the Spy 1D was currently using. The Khibiny pod had been programmed against a documented NATO radar frequency profile. The SPY-1D had been operating on different frequencies for the past 40 minutes. The pod was suppressing signals. The signals it was suppressing were not the ones USS Donald Cook was using to track it. The engagement solutions the Aegis was computing for the Su-24's aircraft. 17 of them since the first pass, none of them authorized, all of them automatically maintained, were based on tracking data as clean as anything the system had processed that week. The money picture on this deserves a moment. The Russian Air Force's operational cost for one Su-24 Fencer on a round-trip mission of approximately 240 nautical miles. Fuel at roughly 2,000 liters per hour. Khibiny pod operational overhead. Ground support. Crew cost. So, $35,000 and $50,000, depending on how the Russian logistics accounting handles the pod's amortized operational rate. The mission's stated objective was to demonstrate electronic warfare capability sufficient to degrade the Aegis combat system of a forward-deployed U.S. Navy warship and generate a visible statement of Russian resolve in the Black Sea. By the metrics the wing commander had briefed, the mission was proceeding correctly. The aircraft was there. The passes were being conducted. The Khibiny pod was operating. The weapons system officer's display was showing positive indicators. The United States Navy's marginal cost for responding to the Su-24's 12-pass visit. F-16 scramble at $25,000 per flight hour. 2 aircraft, 2 hours on station, $100,000. SLQ, 32 exploitation and analysis, $180,000 in analyst time. Total direct U.S. cost, approximately $280,000. The European theater. J2's internal assessment of the Khibiny characterization package. 2 undocumented mode transitions. The complete frequency table. The attack radar timing profile across 12 passes. Place the collection value at approximately $4.1 million against the cost of achieving equivalent data through any other means. The Su-24 crew spent 97 minutes teaching the people they were attempting to intimidate exactly how to defeat the system they were using to intimidate them. The Khibiny pod, it turned out, was a very good teacher. The 12th and final pass occurred at 14:08. It was the same as the 11th, which had been the same as the 10th, in the way that professional crews maintaining a consistent attack profile do not introduce unnecessary variation. The Su-24 completed the breakaway maneuver, climbed to 12,000 feet, and turned northeast. The fuel state had been in the amber reserve for the last 2 passes. The weapons system officer had been monitoring it with the slightly elevated attention that amber fuel reserves command, and the pilot had already calculated that Pass 13 was not available without compromising the recovery margin. The aircraft did not linger. It climbed. It turned. It headed for the coast. The SLQ-32 tracked its navigation radar emission continuously until the contact dropped below radar horizon at 1422. The EW operator logged the final emission time with the satisfied finality of a researcher completing a field study. He had not left his console since 12:17. He had 2 hours and 50 minutes of continuous collection. He had a Khibiny characterization package that the threat library team would spend the next 3 days integrating. He stretched his back. He considered the coffee situation. He decided the coffee situation was not his priority right now. On the port sponson, the boatswain's mate with the needle gun had watched most of the passes with the detached assessment of someone observing an unusual but non-alarming weather pattern. He had watched the first pass with something approaching attention. By the third, he had reached a working theory. The aircraft was going to keep making passes at the same altitude and lateral separation until it ran out of fuel, at which point it would leave. He had developed this theory without formal intelligence training, purely through the application of pattern recognition and the hard-won wisdom of someone who has watched enough situations resolve themselves through the exhaustion of the participant. He had been correct. He noted the aircraft climbing away on the 12th pass, confirmed his theory, and went back to the fitting. The rust had not chipped itself. The operations officer filed the initial after-action report at 19:15 that evening. It ran to 11 pages in standard naval format, documenting 12 simulated attack passes, the communications array maintenance window and its effect on backup system response posture, the F-16s scramble timeline, the complete SLQ-32 collection summary, and an intelligence annex flagged for separate distribution on a list the operations officer did not have full visibility on. The executive summary contained a sentence that took 4 drafts to get right, not because the facts were complicated, but because accurate plain language sometimes requires the kind of precision that takes drafts. The final version read, "No measurable degradation of SPY-1D tracking performance attributable to Khibiny pod electronic countermeasures was observed at any point during the engagement." The operations officer read it over once more. It was accurate. It was complete. It required no elaboration. He submitted the report and went to find something to eat that was not the 1900 galley offering, which had been described to him by 3 separate sources as aggressively beige. By 2000 Moscow time, the Russian Ministry of Defense Communications Directorate had assembled its narrative. The statement distributed through state media channels described the operation as a successful demonstration of advanced Russian electronic warfare capability against a U.S. naval asset, a confirmation of the Khibiny pod's effectiveness in operational conditions, and the detail that propagated furthest and fastest through Western defense media: the temporary disabling of the Aegis combat system aboard USS Donald Cook for the duration of the aircraft's presence in the area. The statement said the American destroyer had been forced to request emergency support from Romanian Air Force assets, which it cited as evidence that the Khibiny pod had achieved its intended suppression effect. The word disabled appeared in the statement 3 times. The briefing slide had been right about one thing. The word got used. Russian military aviation forums ran the story for 2 days. Western defense publications requested comment. The U.S. Navy's response came back in 3 sentences. USS Donald Cook had completed its patrol as planned. The Aegis system had functioned normally throughout the encounter. No further comment. Defense journalists speculated about the implications of the Khibiny pod's claimed performance. Several published pieces with titles suggesting the U.S. Navy had been caught off guard by Russian electronic warfare. The comment sections were active. What none of these publications had access to, what the Russian Ministry of Defense statement had no way of knowing, was the 11-page after-action report and its attached intelligence annex. Specifically, the SPY-1D performance record showing 0 measurable tracking, degradation across 12 passes, the complete Khibiny frequency table, now resident in the NATO Naval Radar Management System as an avoidance profile, meaning that any NATO surface combatant which subsequently received the threat library update would automatically configure its active radar emissions to operate outside the Khibiny pod's jamming envelope, rendering the pod's suppression function approximately as effective as a particularly well-organized yell at a hurricane. And the 2 undocumented mode transitions, which the threat library team had, by the following Monday morning, fully characterized, cataloged, and integrated into the updated defensive response profiles for every Aegis-equipped platform in the European theater. The analyst who had led the exploitation effort arrived at her desk that Monday morning to find the final integration confirmation in her queue. She had been working this collection gap for 11 months. She forwarded the confirmation to her section chief with a note containing 4 words: "Library updated. Task complete." The section chief walked over and said something that the analyst would later describe to a colleague as the most professional compliment I have received in 12 years. She then went to get coffee, reportedly better coffee than USS Donald Cook's, which is a low bar, but not an irrelevant one. The Khibiny pod's designers had built a system intended to render American naval radar ineffective. They had built it well, within their design parameters. What those parameters had not included, what no briefing slide at any Russian airbase had addressed, was the possibility that the most significant output of the Khibiny pod's operational use would be a detailed characterization package that told the people the pod was jamming exactly which frequencies to avoid being jammed on. The pod had been designed to suppress. It had suppressed faithfully across every frequency it had been programmed to cover. The frequencies it had been programmed to cover were the wrong frequencies. The frequencies the SPY-1D had been using were perfectly clear. The Khibiny pod had, in the specific vocabulary of the situation, performed a masterclass in its own limitations for an audience that took very detailed notes. Moscow's evening broadcast said the Aegis had been disabled. The threat library update said the Aegis now knew, in precise technical detail, how to ensure it never would be. The update was distributed to the fleet at 9:30 the following morning. The cover note identified the source event as a Black Sea encounter. It did not mention the ship by name. The people who needed to know already knew. The people who did not know were the ones who had flown the 12 passes and filed the positive mission assessment. They were at the airbase. They were reading the morning broadcast. They were satisfied with their work. They were watching the wrong display. Bye for now.